The Baltic Sea in January is a place of absolute desolation. A vast, black plain of water under a starless sky, where the air is so cold it hurts to breathe, and the waves are tipped with jagged ice. It was into this frozen darkness, on the night of January 30th, 1945, that a colossal white shape pushed forward, its decks blazing with light in a defiant and ultimately fatal act of desperation. This was the Wilhelm Gustloff, a ship built for pleasure, now transformed into a floating city of the damned. On board were not soldiers heading to battle, but the desperate human flotsam of a collapsing empire. Thousands of terrified refugees, mostly women and children, crammed into every cabin, corridor, and stairwell. They were fleeing the relentless Soviet advance in East Prussia, a campaign of vengeance so brutal it had a name, the Nemesis. The Red Army was just days away, and the only escape was west, across the sea. The Gustloff was their ark. But this was no salvation. It was a target. And in less than 2 hours, this single ship would become the stage for a loss of life so staggering it eclipses the Titanic, the Lusitania, and every other maritime tragedy combined. This is the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, history's deadliest shipwreck, a catastrophe born from the final convulsive agony of the Third Reich, where propaganda, panic, and the cruel physics of war conspired to create an unimaginable hell. To understand the magnitude of the disaster, we must first understand the ship and its symbolic journey. Launched in 1937, the Wilhelm Gustloff was not a warship. It was a masterpiece of Nazi propaganda, a strength through joy. Cruise liner designed to give loyal German workers affordable vacations to Italy and the Mediterranean. It was named after a Swiss Nazi assassinated by a Jewish student, a martyr for the cause. For years, it projected an image of a prosperous, powerful Germany at peace. Its swimming pools, sun decks, and spacious lounges were filmed for newsreels, showing smiling Aryan families enjoying the fruits of the Reich. But with the outbreak of war, its white paint was covered in naval gray. It became a barracks ship for U-boat trainees in the port of Gotenhafen, today's Gdynia in Poland. For years it sat, a hollowed-out ghost of its former self, until January 1945, when the Eastern Front collapsed. Operation Hannibal was launched, the largest seaborne evacuation in history, aimed at saving millions of Germans trapped in the East. The Gustloff was hastily recommissioned, but there was no time to retrofit it for such a mission. Marinesko, commander of the Soviet submarine S-13, was a man on the edge. A week earlier, he had been in trouble with his superiors for disciplinary issues and was facing a potential court-martial. He was on a desperate patrol, needing a major victory to redeem himself. On the night of the 30th, through his periscope, he couldn't believe his luck. The Gustloff, lit up like a Christmas tree against the dark sea, was a violation of every blackout procedure. In the chaos of the evacuation, the ship's civilian captains had decided to turn on the navigation lights to avoid a collision with the small minesweeper escort in the constant stream of tiny refugee boats. It was a fatal humanitarian decision. To Marinesko, it was a gift. He didn't see a refugee ship. He saw a giant troopship, likely carrying fresh German reinforcements. He maneuvered the S-13 into position, and at 9:16 p.m., fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. 3 found their mark. Each was inscribed with a hand-painted message for the German people, for the motherland, for the Soviet people, and most chillingly, for Leningrad, a direct reference to the brutal German siege of that city. The torpedoes struck with apocalyptic force. The first blew apart the former swimming pool area, where the female naval auxiliaries were sleeping. Hundreds were killed instantly. The second struck amidships in the engine room. The third hit the bow. The ship shuddered and began to list violently to port. Panic erupted instantly. The orderly escape plan dissolved into a primal struggle for survival. The list was so severe that the lifeboats on the starboard side swung inboard, crashing against the superstructure, impossible to lower. Those on the port side were hanging out over the water, dangling uselessly. People slipped and slid across the icy, tilting decks, piling up against railings before being swept into the sea. Families were torn apart in the darkness. Below, the scenes were worse. Corridors became death traps as water rushed in, trapping thousands in a rising black tomb. The power failed, plunging the interior into utter darkness, punctuated only by screams and the roar of incoming water. In the water, death came quickly. The temperature was around minus 18 degrees Celsius, 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermia could kill in minutes. Most of the victims never even made it to a lifeboat. They succumbed to the cold, or drowned under the weight of their sodden clothes, or were pulled under by the ship suction as the bow rose into the air for the final plunge. The few lifeboats that were launched were dangerously overloaded. The escort ship, the torpedo boat WWII, and other vessels that rushed to the scene could only pull a little over 1,200 survivors from the water and the rafts. For the rest, there was only the endless cold and the fading lights of the ship as it slid beneath the waves at 10:24 p.m., just 70 minutes after being hit. Over 9,000 people, approximately 5,000 of them children, perished. The scale is almost impossible to grasp. It was a tragedy of biblical proportions, hidden by the fog of war and the victor's narrative. In the aftermath, the story was suppressed. For the Nazis, it was a devastating blow to morale they could not admit. The news was buried in brief, vague announcements. For the Soviets, Marinesko was initially hailed as a hero, but the full truth of his target's civilian nature was an uncomfortable complication in the glorious tale of victory. The Gustloff became a forgotten ghost, a casualty lost in the larger arithmetic of a war that had killed tens of millions. It wasn't until decades later, with the work of historians like Heinz Schoen, a survivor himself, that the full human story began to emerge from the depths. The wreck itself lies on the bottom of the Baltic, designated as a war grave. It is a tomb on a scale with no equal, a silent monument to the ultimate cost of war, where the lines between soldier and civilian, aggressor and victim, are irrevocably blurred in the frozen darkness. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff is not just a maritime disaster. It is the stark, terrible epitaph for the collapse of the Third Reich, a tragedy where the innocent paid the ultimate price for a regime's madness, swallowed by a sea as merciless as the war that created it.